What if the greatest innovation of your life wasn't a product, but the way you faced your own mortality? What if the man who taught the world how to think different ultimately had to confront the one thing no amount of genius could outsmart? On a Wednesday afternoon in early October, the news broke like a wave that crashed across every continent, leaving billions in collective silence. The man in the black turtleneck, the one who had made the world believe that technology could be beautiful, that a phone could be magical, that a computer could be a window to the soul, was gone. At the age of 56, Stephen Paul Jobs, the co-founder of Apple Incorporated, the visionary who had revolutionized not one, not two, but half a dozen industries, had taken his final breath. And in that moment, the world didn't just lose a businessman. It lost a poet of the digital age, a philosopher of design, a man whose relentless pursuit of perfection had reshaped the very fabric of modern life. This is the story of Steve Jobs, not as the icon, but as the human being, the adopted son, the dropout, the lover, the father, the tyrant, the genius, and ultimately, the mortal who stared into the abyss and dared to blink last. His full name was Stephen Paul Jobs, but the world would come to know him simply as Steve. He was born on February 24, 1955, in San Francisco, California, at a time when the city was still basking in the post-war glow of optimism and possibility. The hospital where he entered the world was the San Francisco General Hospital, though the details of his birth were immediately shrouded in the kind of secrecy that would come to define so much of his early life. His biological parents were Joanne Carol Schiebel, a graduate student of German and Swiss descent, and Abdul Fattah Jandali, a Syrian teaching assistant who had met Joanne at the University of Wisconsin. They had fallen in love, traveled to Syria together, and returned to America with a child on the way, but the circumstances of their relationship, the disapproval of Joanne's conservative Catholic father, and the simple reality of being unmarried in 1950s America meant that they could not keep their son. And so, Stephen Paul Jobs was given up for adoption, placed into the hands of a couple who would shape him in ways that neither biology nor destiny could have predicted. Paul and Clara Jobs were not wealthy. They were not intellectuals, nor were they visionaries in any conventional sense. Paul was a machinist, a man who worked with his hands, who could fix anything, who taught his son the value of craftsmanship and the satisfaction of building something from nothing. Clara was an accountant, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering love. They lived in a modest home in the suburbs of Mountain View, California, a sleepy community that would, within a few decades, become the epicenter of the technological revolution. The house was unremarkable, the neighborhood was unremarkable, but within those walls, a remarkable mind was beginning to stir. When Steve was still a boy, the family moved again, this time to Los Altos, another quiet Silicon Valley town, where the garages were about to become the birthplaces of empires. It was in that garage, years later, that Apple Computer would be born, but for now, it was simply the place where a young Steve Jobs would tinker with electronics, take apart radios, and wonder how the world worked. Steve was a bright student, almost unnervingly so. He skipped a grade in elementary school, but his brilliance was accompanied by a restlessness that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was shy, not particularly social, and often felt like an outsider, a feeling that was only intensified by the knowledge that he had been given away at birth. The question of who he really was, where he truly came from, haunted him. But in the world of electronics, he found a refuge. A neighbor saw his potential and encouraged him to join an electronics club sponsored by Hewlett-Packard, one of the giant corporations that dotted the Silicon Valley landscape. It was at one of those meetings that Steve, at the age of 12, saw his first computer. He was mesmerized. He didn't just see a machine, he saw a future. He saw a way to connect the dots that no one else could see. He saw power, beauty, and possibility, all wrapped up in a tangle of wires and silicon chips. And he knew, with the certainty of a child who has found his calling, that this was what he was meant to do. By the time he reached high school, Steve had already begun to carve out an identity that was uniquely his own. He was a hippie, with long hair and ripped jeans, a seeker of truth who was just as interested in Eastern philosophy as he was in circuit boards. He met another Steve, a quiet, brilliant engineer named Steve Wozniak, who shared his passion for electronics and, more importantly, possessed the technical genius that Steve himself lacked. Together, they embarked on a series of projects, pranks, and experiments that would lay the groundwork for a partnership that would change the world. But first, Steve had to navigate the tumultuous waters of young adulthood. He enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, an expensive liberal art school that his adoptive parents could barely afford. He lasted one semester. He dropped out, not because he was a failure, but because he couldn't see the point of spending his parents' life savings on an education that felt irrelevant to his destiny. He stayed on campus, sleeping on the floors of friends' dorm rooms, dropping in on classes that interested him, including a calligraphy course that would later inspire the typography of the Macintosh computer. He was a dropout, a drifter, a young man searching for meaning in a world that seemed to offer none. And then came the journey that would fundamentally alter the course of his life. In 1974, Steve Jobs traveled to India, seeking spiritual enlightenment in the land that had given birth to Buddhism. He returned to California transformed, not by any single revelation, but by the cumulative experience of seeing a world beyond the materialism of America. He shaved his head, wore traditional Indian clothing, and embraced the principles of Zen Buddhism with a fervor that would influence his aesthetic sensibilities for the rest of his life. Simplicity, minimalism, the elimination of clutter, these were not just design principles, they were spiritual practices. He took a job at Atari, the video game company, where his eccentricities were tolerated because his intensity was recognized. He was difficult, demanding, sometimes unbearable, but there was something about him that made people believe. He had a reality distortion field, a force field of charisma and conviction that made the impossible seem inevitable. And it was this quality, this almost supernatural ability to bend the world to his will, that would propel him to the heights of human achievement. In 1976, Steve Jobs was 21 years old. He and Steve Wozniak, along with a third partner, Ronald Wayne, founded Apple Computer Company. They built their first product, the Apple I, in the garage of Steve's childhood home in Los Altos. Steve sold his Volkswagen van to help finance the venture. Wozniak designed the computer, a primitive machine that sold for $666.66, with no keyboard, no display, and no case. Customers had to assemble it themselves. It was a modest beginning, the kind of humble origin story that Silicon Valley legends are made of. But what set Steve apart from Wozniak, what set him apart from every other engineer in the Homebrew Computer Club, was his vision. He didn't see the Apple I as a hobbyist's toy. He saw it as the first step toward a world where everyone, not just techies, could use a computer. He saw the potential for a machine that was beautiful, intuitive, and accessible. And he was willing to do whatever it took to make that vision a reality. The Apple II, released in 1977, was the breakthrough. It was one of the first highly successful mass-produced microcomputers, and it made Apple a household name. Steve Jobs was now a millionaire, a celebrity, and the face of a revolution. But success did not temper his intensity. If anything, it amplified it. He was a perfectionist, a tyrant, a man who could reduce his employees to tears with a single glance. He demanded excellence, not because he was cruel, but because he believed that anything less was an insult to the customer and to the universe itself. He was driven by a philosophy that was part Zen, part Nietzsche, and wholly his own. He believed that the products Apple created were not just machines, they were expressions of human potential. They were tools that could help people think different, create different, live different. And he would accept nothing less than perfection. But perfection is a dangerous master, and by 1985, Steve Jobs' relentless pursuit of it had created enemies. A power struggle with Apple's CEO, John Sculley, whom Jobs had famously recruited with a question: do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? Led to Jobs being ousted from the company he had founded. He was 30 years old, a billionaire, and a failure. The board of directors had sided with Sculley, and Jobs was out. It was a devastating blow, a public humiliation that would have destroyed a lesser man. But Steve Jobs was not a lesser man. He was a man who had been given up at birth, who had dropped out of college, who had traveled to India in search of meaning. He had faced rejection before, and he would face it again. He did not retreat. He did not surrender. He founded a new company, Next, dedicated to building powerful computers for the education market. And he bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas, turning it into a little animation studio called Pixar. The decade that followed, often referred to as Jobs' wilderness years, was actually the most pivotal period of his life. At Next, he learned hard lessons about business, about management, about the difference between a great product and a commercially viable one. He poured massive resources into creating a beautiful, expensive computer that never commanded a serious market. He was forced to lay off most of his staff, shift his focus from hardware to software, and engineer a development environment that would later prove instrumental in building Apple's online stores. It was a humbling experience, but it was also an education. He learned how to make the most of partnerships, how to negotiate, and how to manage creative talent. He developed an adaptability that would be critical to his later success. At Pixar, he faced similar challenges. His initial plan for the company did not pan out, but he adapted, shifting the company's focus from selling hardware to creating content. He negotiated a $26 million marketing distribution deal with Disney, a partnership that saved Pixar and gave it the capital to produce the world's first full-length computer-animated feature film. That film, Toy Story, released in 1995, was a cultural phenomenon. It made Pixar a household name, and it made Steve Jobs a billionaire. Not because of Apple, but because of a little animation studio that he had bought on a whim. By 1996, Apple was in trouble. The company that Jobs had founded was on the brink of bankruptcy, bleeding money, and losing market share to Microsoft. It needed a miracle, and the miracle had a name: NEX Step, the operating system that Jobs' company had developed. Apple bought Next for $400 million, and Steve Jobs returned to Apple as an advisor. Within a year, he was CEO, and within a decade, he had transformed the company from a struggling also-ran into one of the most valuable corporations in human history. His return to Apple is the stuff of legend. He streamlined the product line, eliminating dozens of confusing models and focusing on just 4 core products. He introduced the iMac, a colorful, all-in-one computer that looked like nothing else on the market. It was a hit. He introduced the iPod, a portable music player that made the Walkman look like a relic from the Stone Age. It was a phenomenon. He introduced the iTunes Store, a digital music marketplace that revolutionized the music industry. He introduced the iPhone, a smartphone that changed the way the world communicates, works, and lives. He introduced the iPad, a tablet that created an entirely new category of computing. Each product was a masterclass in design, marketing, and user experience. Each product was a reflection of Steve Jobs' singular vision. He had returned from exile and conquered the world. But Steve Jobs was more than a product visionary. He was a showman, a storyteller, a man who understood that technology was not about specifications and features, but about emotion and aspiration. His keynote presentations, held at the annual Macworld conferences, were legendary. He would walk on stage, dressed in his signature black turtleneck, blue jeans, and New Balance sneakers, and hold the audience in the palm of his hand. He would tease, tantalize, and reveal, building anticipation with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony. When he introduced the iPhone in 2007, he famously said that Apple was going to reinvent the phone. And then he did. The iPhone was not just a phone. It was a computer in your pocket, a music player, a camera, a navigation device, a gaming console, and a window to the entire world. It was, in Jobs' own words, an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, all rolled into one. The audience erupted in applause. They were witnessing history. They were witnessing the genius of Steve Jobs. Yet, even as he reached the pinnacle of his career, the shadows were gathering. In 2003, Jobs was diagnosed with a neuroendocrine tumor of the pancreas, a rare and relatively slow-growing form of cancer. Unlike the far more common and aggressive adenocarcinoma, this tumor, an islet cell neuroendocrine tumor, was potentially treatable with surgery. But Steve Jobs, The man who had always marched to the beat of his own drum, who had always believed that he could think his way out of any problem, resisted his doctor's recommendations. For 9 months, he pursued alternative therapies, a special diet, acupuncture, herbal remedies, and other unconventional treatments. He believed, with the fervor of a true believer, that he could beat cancer through willpower and nutrition. It was a decision that would haunt him and his family for the rest of his days. By the time he finally agreed to undergo surgery in 2004, the Whipple procedure, a complex operation that removed the head of his pancreas, part of his small intestine, his gallbladder, and part of his bile duct, the cancer may have already spread beyond his pancreas. He seemed to recover. In 2005, he delivered the now famous commencement address at Stanford University, where he told the graduates, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart." The speech was a meditation on mortality, a reflection on his own brush with death, and it resonated with millions around the world. But the cancer was not gone. It had metastasized, spreading to his liver. In 2009, he underwent a liver transplant, a desperate measure to extend his life. He appeared gaunt, frail, and visibly weakened, but he continued to work, continued to push, continued to demand perfection from everyone around him. He was, in many ways, the same man he had always been, relentless, uncompromising, and utterly convinced of his own vision. But even Steve Jobs could not outrun the inevitable. In January of 2011, he took a medical leave of absence from Apple. In August, he resigned as CEO, writing a letter to the Apple board and the Apple community that was as elegant and poignant as any product he had ever created. He wrote, "I have always said if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." He was appointed chairman of the board, a ceremonial role, but everyone knew the end was near. He spent his final months at home, in Palo Alto, surrounded by his wife and children, in the 7-bedroom English Tudor-style house on Waverly Street that he had purchased in 1984. He was cared for by his family, including his wife Lorraine Powell Jobs, whom he had married in 1991, and his 4 children, Lisa, from his relationship with Kristen Brennan, and Reed, Erin, and Eve, from his marriage to Lorraine. He was a devoted father in his later years, a man who had come to value family above all else. He spent his final days in a bedroom on the ground floor, surrounded by photographs of his loved ones, looking out at the garden he had designed as a space for meditation and reflection. On the morning of October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs took his final breath. The official cause of death was respiratory arrest, a direct consequence of the cancer that had metastasized to his other organs. He was 56 years old. He died at his home in Palo Alto, California, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. His final words, as recounted by his sister, Mona Simpson, were 3 monosyllables, repeated, "Oh wow. Oh wow. Oh wow." His tone, she said, was affectionate, dear, loving, but like someone whose luggage was already strapped onto the vehicle, who was already on the beginning of his journey, even as he was sorry, truly deeply sorry, to be leaving us. "Death did not happen to Steve," she wrote. "He achieved it. He was working at it, pushing farther than before, climbing a steep path, even as his breath indicated an arduous journey." His family gathered around him, including his wife Lorraine, his children, and his sister. They held him, they loved him, and they let him go. The news of his death spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media was flooded with tributes. Within hours, every news outlet in the world had led with the story. People gathered outside Apple stores, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. The tributes poured in from around the globe, from presidents and prime ministers, from competitors and collaborators, from fans and friends. Barack Obama, the President of the United States, issued a statement, calling Jobs one of the greatest American innovators. Bill Gates, his longtime rival and occasional friend, said, "The world rarely sees someone who has had the profound impact Steve has had, the effects of which will be felt for generations to come." The outpouring of grief was unprecedented. It was not just a tribute to a businessman. It was a tribute to a man who had touched the lives of billions through his products, his vision, and his relentless pursuit of excellence. The funeral was held privately, a small ceremony attended only by his closest family and friends. He was buried on a Friday at the Alta Mesa Memorial Park in Palo Alto, California, a leafy, non-denominational cemetery in the foothills, not far from the home where he had grown up. His grave is unmarked, a deliberate decision by his family to protect his privacy, even in death. But fans continue to come, searching for a trace of the man who changed their world. He rests among pioneering technologists he admired, including David Packard and Walter Hewlett, the founders of Hewlett-Packard, and even Shirley Temple. His adoptive parents, Paul and Clara Jobs, are also interred there. It is a peaceful, serene resting place, a fitting final home for a man who sought simplicity and beauty in everything he did. In the years since his death, Steve Jobs' legacy has only grown. Apple has continued to thrive, becoming the first American company to reach a market valuation of $3 trillion. The products he envisioned, the iPhone, the iPad, the Mac, have become indispensable parts of modern life. But his legacy is not just about products. It is about a way of thinking. He taught the world that design matters, that beauty matters, that the marriage of technology and the liberal arts is the key to innovation. He taught us that we should never settle, that we should always strive for excellence, and that the only way to do great work is to love what you do. He was a man of contradictions, a genius who could be cruel, a visionary who could be blind, a leader who could be a tyrant. But he was also a man of profound insight, a man who understood that the journey is the reward, that the dots only connect backwards, and that death is the single best invention of life. In 2022, he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States, a recognition of his profound impact on the world. And so, we are left to wonder, what if Steve Jobs had made different choices? What if he had not delayed his surgery? What if he had lived another decade, another 2 decades? What new wonders might he have brought into the world? We will never know. But we do know this: the world is immeasurably better because he was in it. He did not just change the technology industry. He changed the way we live, the way we work, the way we communicate, and the way we dream. He showed us that one person, armed with nothing but vision and determination, can reshape the world. He showed us that it is possible to think different. And he showed us that even in the face of death, we can still say, "Oh wow." If this story of Steve Jobs moved you, if it reminded you of the power of vision and the fragility of life, please take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to Before Die, where we bring you the untold stories of the icons who shaped our world. Share your memories of Steve Jobs in the comments below. What was the first Apple product you ever owned? How did his vision change your life? And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss another story from Before Die. Thank you for watching, and remember, every life is a story worth telling.